start by introducing JP or James. If you could just give everyone a wave. James works with precision nutrition and hydration. I'll let him tell you a little bit about himself once he gets started. And with him is Chris, and Chris will be monitoring the chat. So if you've got questions as we're going along, put them in the chat and Chris will try to answer them in the chat, or he will make a note of them to ask James at the end, depending on what the question is. I know a lot of you sent questions in to start with. I've sent all of those over to JP. He's seen all the questions, and then he's prepared a presentation where we hope we will answer most of those questions that you've sent in. But obviously, at the end of the presentation, if you feel your question hasn't been addressed properly, or you've got another query, stick it in the chat. We want to make this as informative as possible, but because with so many people on this call, it'll be easier to manage it if we put questions through the chat. JP, I'm still admitting people, but maybe you could just do a little bit, tell people a little bit about yourself, and maybe Chris, you could just say a few words as well, and then get going with your presentation.
Yeah, no problem at all. It's lovely to meet everybody. Thank you for taking time out of your evening to listen to me waffle on for the next roughly 55 minutes. So as Simon said, I head up our athlete support team here at Precision Fuel and Hydration. I've been with the company for the last 7 years, and really across that time I've worked with athletes of all walks of life, whilst also dabbling in a number of different endurance activities myself. My background is in triathlon. I'm blessed to live on the south coast of the UK, just outside Bournemouth, and do a fair amount of open water swimming myself with the gentleman sat across the table with me. I've done in recent times quite a bit of swim run, which, if you don't know, involved there. It is where you tie yourself to a partner and swim in the open water, and then run on the trails, and then jump back in and jump back out a lot. So yeah, a fair amount of experience, but nothing particularly long. So I'll quickly let Chris introduce himself. Chris is here as a bit more expert in long distance open water swimming. He's going to be doing the Ultra Swim 33.3 in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, thanks for that, JP. Yeah, I'm Chris. I'm one of the sports scientists here at Precision. I've been here for 2.5 years now. Actually met JP open water swimming on the infamous South Coast. Is how I wore him down to get myself a job here. But yeah, similar to JP, but I actually spend most of my day talking to high-level ambassadors and professional athletes. Oh, apologies for the echoing. We will quickly try and sort that out. But yeah, I have a background in long distance triathlon. I've done a swim run. More recently, I've been focusing on Ironman distance triathlon, and was recently coaxed into doing the swim run, the ultra swim, like JP said. A vicious rumour that I could be having to do the full 33 kilometres as an exhibition swim on the Sunday in one go, but I'm choosing not to think about that too deeply just yet. So hopefully the presentation JP's got tonight, and then the questions afterwards will help box off any questions you might have about the particular swimming events that you've got coming up. And if not, feel free just to fire them up.
Just a quick reminder, I am muting people if I see that you're not muted, but if you are not muted, please can you go on mute, because we've got a lot of people in the room, and we get a little bit of noise and feedback if you're not on mute. And James, do you want to fire up your screen and launch into your presentation?
Absolutely. I think before I do that and can't see everyone, as Simon said, please do fire away questions. I will try and rattle through this. I'm aware there's a pretty broad spread of abilities and different goals, so we'll try and cover as much as we can. But if you have specific questions like the Windermere one that's just come in, let's come to them at the end. Hopefully we'll focus on some principles early on, answer some questions, and then get more specific as the evening goes on, because otherwise we'll end up just going for every single event under the sun, and we'll never get to the big picture stuff. So let me share the screen. Right, hopefully everyone can see that and hear me. So I think one of the biggest problems with sports nutrition, fueling and hydration is confusion. You know, you Google what should I eat and drink for X, Y, and Z, and you get hundreds, if not thousands of pages of results, and they're often contradicting and intimidating and just make you feel like you need a PhD to understand what's going on. I think the reality is actually when you strip a lot of that smoke and mirrors away, good fuel and hydration practices are actually very simple. We use an approach called the 3 levers for endurance, fuel, and hydration. So that encompasses lever number 1, which is carbohydrates. So carbohydrates for most people, most of the time, when performance is the goal, is the number 1 fuel source that you need. We'll talk more in detail clearly on all of these as we go, but I'll just quickly highlight them. Levers 2 and 3 are intertwined. 2 being sodium, the main electrolyte lost in sweat, and 3 being fluid, makes up more than 70% of the total body mass of a human. So unsurprising that it's relatively important. So let's start diving into them. Number 1, carbohydrates. So the good news is fuel and carbohydrates have been researched for as long as sports science has existed. So the first published historical study was done in the 1920s, looking at people running, unfortunately, not swimming, in the Boston Marathon, and involved them sucking on hard-boiled sweets and drinking sweet tea. And pretty much ever since that first study confirmed that sugar helped both performance and recovery off the back of endurance performance, it's been probably the most widely researched thing in sports science. The good news is pretty much all the time the research has led to the same conclusion. It's necessary, dosing is important, and it results in better performance and better recovery. Why we need carbohydrates? Carbohydrates are stored in both the muscle and the liver, glycogen, and then it is released into the bloodstream and used as energy. We have a limited store. A lot of you might have read, you have up to 90 minutes worth of glycogen stored in the body, whereas you have thousands of hours worth of fat. Unfortunately, the body isn't particularly adept at using that fat. And the moment you start going above a brisk walk in terms of effort, you start using more carbohydrate than fat. So that's a whole debate we could spend an hour talking about. But fundamentally, if you think about the moment you're working harder than an easy walk, you're going to be using typically more carbohydrate than fat, and you have a limited store. So you need to make sure you don't run out, because if anybody in the room has ever experienced hitting the wall or bonking or any of that, you realize it's a god-awful experience that wouldn't wish upon anybody. How much is the inevitable question always. Luckily, all of the research has led to a pretty simple diagram, which we like to show in this way. The 2 factors that influence carbohydrate requirements are exercise intensity and exercise duration. Fundamentally, the longer you go and the harder you go, the more you need. That is really the headline of it. The limiter, more often than not, is personal tolerance. Some people can take astronomical amounts of carbohydrates. We work with athletes in sports who take north of 150 grams per hour. Clearly, in sport like swimming and open water swimming specifically, the logistics play a massive part, and that is really what dictates it. But fundamentally, when all sports, all activities, regardless of what's happening, this very simple graph has what science has led to kind of form most fueling plans. So if we move on to the other 2 levers, hydration, you could kind of broadly term them as I said earlier, both sodium and fluid are intertwined. This is where things get a little bit more interesting, because as opposed to carbohydrate, where this is a net amount, you want a very stable plan. A good fueling plan is very stable. It might be that you take 30 grams of carbohydrate every hour for 24 hours. How you make that up is both based on logistics and personal preference. It might be that you take a sports gel in hour 1, an energy drink in hour 2, a banana in hour 3, a jam sandwich in hour 4, and then a gel in hour 5. Fundamentally, the body responds to carbohydrates in the same way. There's always a slightly different digestive time, but when you're going super long, that is kind of irrelevant. It more comes down to personal preference and the ability for your body to tolerate that intake. But the key is that it should be very stable. When it comes to fluid, it is enormously variable. So these two things on the screen are part of something that we call the sweat equation, which is this little algorithm we've got on the screen here. And the reason for that is because everybody sweats differently, as it says. So the two components of sweating physiology are sweat concentration, also referred to as the saltiness of your sweat, or sweat sodium concentration. That is massively variable from person to person. It can vary tenfold. So the scale of loss, which I'll go on to on my next slide, is somewhere from, let's go here actually, about 200 milligrams of sodium can be lost per 1 litre of sweat, all the way up to about 2,500 milligrams lost per 1 litre of sweat. The unit measure is really important, as I just said. So this is measured in a lab-based setting at rest. And it comes out as a milligram lost per 1 litre of sweat. This, and on the surface, sounds a bit confusing, but fundamentally, you could lose 1 litre of sweat an hour, or half a litre of sweat, or 2.5 litres of sweat, based on how hard you're going, how hot it is, your own physiology. But if you think of the human body like a big barrel of water with salt in it, if someone opens the tap a little bit, simulating swimming in a cool environment, a salty fluid comes out. But if you open that tap wide and the fluid pours out much quicker, simulating someone swimming in a 30-degree indoor pool whilst doing intervals, it's the same salty fluid. It's just leaving the body faster in greater quantities. So everybody sits on this scale somewhere. I'm particularly salty. I sit up here. But everybody could be somewhere else. We see an average of about 950 to 980 milligrams per litre. When you compare that to a typical electrolyte hydration-based product that sits somewhere between 200 and 400 milligrams per litre. So if you likely all got a little tube of something in the cupboard that you've got from an event or from the middle aisle of one of the famous middle aisle shops. If you have a look afterwards at the sodium content, you'll see that it sits somewhere in that 200 to 400 range, which is anywhere up to 10 times less than what people could need, which is really what was the reason for the company in the first place. We started off by doing these sweat tests and recommending appropriate hydration-based solutions based on the losses. Since then, clearly things have evolved and we've become a slightly more holistic, all-encompassing company, but this is really where it all began. The good news is once you do know where you are on the scale, it doesn't really change. Post-adolescence, it's a bit like shoe size. You kind of are where you are and you're locked there. External variables don't really change it. So I am a very salty sweater. If I eat an extremely salty meal, I'm not a more salty sweater. Or if I don't eat a salty meal, I'm not a less salty sweater. I pretty much am within a band around where that arrow is pointing every day, have been for the last 7 years and will continue to be for the next 7 years. So although there is massive variance across individuals, your inter-individual variability is very, very small. We go back to this sweat equation. The next bit we're going to look at is the rate. So this is much simpler to test. You don't need to go to a lab to sit down and use a medical grade bit of kit. You can simply weigh yourself on a set of bathroom scales. This is relevant for activities that range from 45 minutes to around 3 hours. Beyond that kind of time frame, you will start to use it won't entirely be sweat loss that contributes to the weight loss. So if you're interested in determining your own sweat rate, which will tell you how much fluid you lose in an activity and will educate how much fluid you should drink in said activity in the future, you simply need to jump on a set of scales nude before you jump in the pool, not on poolside, or else you get arrested, and I don't want any of those emails in my inbox telling me it was my fault. Weigh yourself before you get in, ideally holding a bottle if you're going to drink anything. Do your session in the lake or a pool, jump back out again, get on the same set of scales, take your swimming kit off again so there's no water weight attached to the clothing, holding the empty or half drank bottle. And fundamentally, a kilo loss is the equivalent of a litre. So if I were to jump in the sea weighing 70 kilos and I'm not going to drink anything for an hour, and I get out an hour later, I'm 69 kilos. On that day, in that water, wearing a wetsuit, swimming at that intensity, my sweat rate was 1 litre an hour. If I was to be planning to swim, for 4 hours in the future, I could use that information to say, right, I know that I'm going to lose roughly 1 litre for every hour that I swim if everything else remains equal. How much do I need to drink? Fundamentally, the aim of drinking is to avoid a body weight loss of no more than 3 to 5%. Science shows us more than that is detrimental to performance. So I'd know that if 1% of my body weight is 1.5 kilos, I need to drink, I put myself on the spot doing some mental maths here, I'm not quite sure what it works out as, but you get where I'm going. If I'm trying to avoid a loss of 3 kilos and I'm losing 1 litre an hour and I'm swimming for 4 hours, I need to make sure I'm drinking, a couple of 100 ml every hour, or doing one big stop in the middle and drinking X amount to make up for that.
A really good question that's just come in the chat, actually, which is relevant for right now, is someone has asked, showing my ignorance, but it's not at all, do we sweat the same in water as we would when running? I thought I would sweat less in water.
Yeah, fantastic question, and one that comes up frequently in these kind of forums. Fundamentally, yes, you do sweat when you swim, absolutely. It has been shown in research to be less than other endurance activities such as running or riding. That being said, the variable of water temperature, or wetsuit, non-wetsuit, and water temperature has a really significant impact on how much you sweat. It will pretty much always be less than the equivalent effort if you use a metric like heart rate to control effort. Swimming will always elicit a lesser sweat rate than running, but if you were swimming in the open water in 15, 16 degrees in the UK, non-wetsuit, clearly your sweat rate is going to be astronomically less than jumping in a 30-degree public pool and doing the same effort. When you layer in higher intensity and or wetsuit, those factors all play in. The good news is, regardless of what specific type of swimming you're doing, open water, wetsuit, open water, non-wetsuit, hot water, cold water, all of those things, the weighing pre and post is equally as accurate. So you can do it if you're training. For example, I spoke to an athlete the other day who was doing a swim in Mexico where the water is going to be somewhere between 29 and 30 degrees. It's an open water swim, but they're training fundamentally in the pool. And luckily their local pool is a very similar temperature to that. So they are able to do some of this sweat rate measurement that I just talked about in their controlled indoor environment, and it's representative of the outdoor activity they're going to do. Hopefully that answers the question. There is, I'm sure Chris has just done it, we have a blog that answers that question and shows links to the research mentioned and puts the numbers on it, which I don't have to hand, but I'm pretty sure that will be in there already, if not there. I think, as Simon said at the start, fundamentally I think, Simon, we were talking about this before everyone got in, whilst we were chewing your ear about swimming in general. One of if not one of the most important elements when it comes to swimming, hydration and fueling. And I think there is a definition to be made. We generally focus on fueling as opposed to nutrition. I think nutrition can be seen as day-to-day eating habits, which are clearly very important for everybody in all walks of life. But when we say fueling, it's a purposeful use of the word, because we focus on roughly 60 minutes before an activity, the activity itself, and then 60 minutes post the activity. Otherwise, things get you need to apply as much focus to your day-to-day nutrition as you do your exercise fueling. Those two things need to fit like hand in glove. You can't get away with having poor nutrition and good fueling, or good the other way around. They both need to be good, but they are independent. One of the main reasons for that is that good fueling is terrible outside of exercise. That's because of what I said right at the start, where carbohydrates and simple sugars are fantastic for exercise, but terrible when you're sat on the sofa, where, as far as the body's concerned, as much as that pains me to say it, and I'd like to sit and eat Haribo all day and not worry about it. It's a great choice when you are going out for a long swim, but maybe not a great choice when you are sat on the sofa. But yeah, pre-fueling and pre-hydration for most people most of the time is really all they can do when it comes to swimming, because of the practicalities of it, especially as, you know, clearly most of you are open water swimmers. You're probably not blessed with personal kayakers to follow you around carrying a bottle and whatnot. Potentially you're at a lake where you can do laps and pick up during, but most of the time, most people are swimming for under 90 minutes, and all they're going to do is what they do prior to the activity and post the activity. The good news is, in a lot of situations, that's absolutely fine most of the time. So best practices, very simple. Take something like a 30-gram carbohydrate gel 15 minutes before you get in. It takes about 15 minutes for the sugar to peak in your bloodstream, so it will kick in once you start swimming. It will save some of those stored, some of the stored glycogen in your muscle and your liver. If you are starting fasted, you know, if you come from a swimming background and you're used to swimming early doors and you don't want to eat much breakfast before you go, this will also start to replenish some of the glycogen you've burnt overnight whilst you're sleeping, because fundamentally the brain uses glycogen from the liver whilst you're sleeping to fuel it. So you do want to store some of that up. If we start kind of blurring the line into nutrition, if it were me, I'd have a small carbohydrate-based snack, like a piece of toast or a banana, when I wake up before I were going to the lake, just so that I do exactly what I just said, restore some of that glycogen I've burnt overnight. Then any that I take just prior to the activity or in the activity purely goes towards fueling that activity. Again, that basically summarizes what I just said, provides additional fuel to be utilized and helps preserve some of the stored glycogen for later on. For hydration, we were talking about the difference between kind of pre-hydration and over-hydration in a prior discussion. And I think that's another really important distinction to make. People see pre-drinking or we call it pre-loading because it's not the same as pre-hydration. Pre-hydration is simply drinking, and by pre-drinking and drinking more than you're losing, the body is like a sponge when it comes to hydration. Once it is saturated, there is nowhere for the additional fluid to go. So if you're doing a big swim on a weekend and you think on Wednesday, right, I'm going to start drinking more now because that will do me a favor come Saturday, as soon as that sponge is saturated, you will just wear out. And that comes with its own problems because the body doesn't know how to hold on to certain minerals that you need, such as sodium. And then at the most dangerous stage of this, if you start to dilute the body's blood sodium stores by drinking water in excess of your losses and peeing very excessively, and then you start sweating, you can actually induce a condition called hyponatremia, which is low blood sodium. At its worst, it can be fatal. At best case scenario, it makes you feel awful when you underperform. So really, when we talk about pre-hydration and preloading, the focus should be on not excessively drinking, but being very defined and precise with a pre-hydration protocol that is focused on the 90 minutes before you start, where you take a very strong electrolyte-based solution, something like our pH 1500, in about 500 mils of fluid. this creates a very strong osmotic gradient that results in some additional water retention. So you basically start with more water on board than you typically would, which gives you more in the well to lose later on. Again, both of these things may feel excessive in a lot of situations, but with long distance swimming and open water swimming, where the next feed or the next drink is somewhat unknown, if you get caught in a tide and it takes 90 minutes to get to the feed instead of 45, you almost want to always try and be on the front foot. I think for me, compared to running or cycling or anything else, swimming is one of these sports where you really need to, you're kind of forced, your hand is forced to kind of overhydrate and overfuel a little bit when you can, so that you're able to get yourself to the next point, because it's so out of your control compared to more fixed activities. Yeah, that covers what you said. So next big clear question is, once I'm swimming, how do I do this? What do I do? Now, unfortunately, there is no simple answer. When you look at open water swimming competitions and activities and all sorts, there are so many different ways. Clearly, you can use the aid stations if they have them, or if it's a lapped-based lake swim, or you have your own personal kayaker, you can stop and eat or drink. That is very simple stuff. Clearly, if you are, I don't know if anybody in the group hasn't ever gone on YouTube and watched some of the Olympic open water swimming and how they feel, it is amazing to see. It is hugely impressive. One of our ambassadors, Andy Donaldson, is an incredible open water swimmer, and he has a video of him swimming 40 kilometers, and he averaged 1 minute 14 per 100 pace for the 40 kilometers. And he manages to feed off of a pole like this. These are really rudimentary fishing poles with bottles sellotaped to the end of them. He manages to not break stroke, fuel, and maintain a 1 minute 20 second per 100 pace, which I can imagine most people in the world would be happy to swim 1 minute per 20 pace as a sprint, let alone whilst chugging half a litre of highly concentrated carbohydrate mix. But yeah, if you haven't watched it, definitely do. Probably not applicable to many people in the world being able to do that, but still very impressive. Most likely it's going to be something that looks a little bit more like this, a little bit less sexy, but a little bit more realistic and practical. You can see this guy here has done the very sensible thing where he has a pre-mixed bottle. In this setting, he did have a personal kayaker. So if you're doing something like the Windermere, like was mentioned in the chat before I started, I'm assuming you'll have a personal kayaker, because most people do when they do that. You load that up in advance. A really good way of doing it is creating your preferred mixture of bottle, be that fluids and electrolytes, or fluids, electrolytes and carbs, or just carbs. And then also taping or elastic banding some kind of snack to the outside. So when someone gives it to you, you can flip onto your back, have a drink, pull off what you need, most likely a gel, because that's the most functional and practical thing to use, sink it down, and then get back on, and you've stopped for a handful of seconds, hopefully, and carried on.
The only thing I would possibly add to that is there's been a couple of questions about using just energy products for this. And you can see in the picture down the bottom left, where there's a huge stack of some sliced up bananas. That's a picture from one of the ultra swim races. But even with your personal kayaker or whatever you're choosing to use, like JP mentioned earlier, carbohydrates is the main source that you're after here. And if you practice enough with the right things, you really don't have to just rely on gels or even sports nutrition. They are designed for a purpose, and they're very convenient and offer a large amount of carbs for a small amount of either fluid or semi-solid, but it doesn't have to be the only fuel source. And for most people doing very long swims, we would both recommend that it isn't your only fuel source, because you might get simply bored of the taste of the same thing over and over. And also, you might need something a little bit more than just plain carbohydrates, a little bit of proteins in there, some other vitamins and minerals, like JP said, you don't get from just specific sports nutrition. So you can include other things in your fueling strategy, but just make sure you're aware of how much carbohydrates are in them and that you've practiced using it beforehand. Don't try anything for the first time during one of these long swims, because the last thing you want to do is ruin your chances of enjoying it and doing a good swim just because you did something for the first time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really valid point. One thing we haven't kind of hit on yet is what happens as the durations kind of extend. It's one of the questions that we're going to come to at the end, but it's probably worth, as we're here now, discussing it. I think as Chris said, the longer you go, the greater percentage of real food comes into it. I think the reality is, if you were to swim for under 2 hours, in the same way that, you know, the purposeful nature of some kind of sports drink or sports-based gel is entirely, you know, people will do 2-hour events purely on those. When you start looking at 6-hour events, you might bring in 25% real food, 75% sport product. When you're going maybe 8, 9, 10 hours, that suddenly shifts closer probably to something like 50% each. When you go, you know, 24 hours, all of a sudden you're at, you know, maybe it's as low as 30% in total sports-based products and 70% real food. That, as the intensity drops and your body's able to process more real foods, because you have to drop the intensity clearly because you're going for so long, and the ability to add variety in is greater with more real food options. That change kind of evolves as the event distance increases. Clearly as well, the way we're talking about this is when performance is the goal. If you are going out for a long swim with friends, performance and fastest times are not the goal, then that changes things entirely. I would be choosing, for example, if I went out with Chris this weekend for a long 10K open water swim, I wouldn't be looking to use gels and sports drinks. I would take something that I like. Personally, I'm a big fan of, we do a product called a Sport Chew, but it's kind of similar to Turkish Delight. I would be using something like that, or a Haribo or a Jelly Baby, because for me, I enjoy taking them. It's easy to get hold of, it's easy to eat, makes us pause for 20 seconds, and then we carry on. If we were in the pool doing reps of 100, in there for 6K, then I'd have a sports drink on the side, because there's no chance I'm going to chew something like that. So as of everything, it changes, depends on the setting. Right. So one thing that we have coming soon, which is really exciting actually, in conjunction with both UltraSwim and Andy Donaldson, we are developing a open water swimming fuel and hydration planner. So we currently have a fuel and hydration planner that's free on the website. You can add running, triathlon, cycling, other activities, but we are yet to introduce swimming because there are so many variables at play. We want to make sure that it is the best it can possibly be. So that is coming in the next couple of weeks. I was really hoping it would be ready for me to go, look at this, it's ready. But unfortunately, it is just not quite there. But when it is out, we'll share the link with Simon, and he'll no doubt share the link with you all. And that's a fantastic way to see how the recommendations in terms of headline figures, what kind of grams of carbohydrate or milliliters of fluid or milligrams of sodium you should be looking for based on a series of subjective questions. It doesn't take more than a couple of minutes to do. And you can see how that changes for a 12-hour Windermere versus a 3-hour 10K versus a 6-hour 10K or whatever. You can put in as many time and as many events and distances and times as you like to see how it changes, change your own inputs. And that I wish was able to share now, but is coming in the next couple of weeks. Right, that is the end. I'm aware I've rattled through that, and I can see the chat is going off, and I feel like, Simon, we should jump into...
Yes, and that was great. Thank you very much. And I know that I haven't been able to follow the chat as well, because I've been watching to make sure that anyone who's trying to join has been able to get in. But I see that Chris has been answering questions in there. I think what I've tried and jump to is trying to cover off some of the questions that came in beforehand. But I've got one from myself before I'm going to go to everybody else's, because because I can. The recommendations you were just giving, I think it was primarily for a event. Do you follow a similar protocol for training, or are you more relaxed about training? And you don't need to be so on top of your fueling for training as you do for an event, for example.
I think it depends on the training activity. For example, if it was our typical summer swim as a small South Coast group of 30 people, is getting in and swimming between 45 minutes to an hour, all different abilities. Everybody swims to a point and turns around and come back. Most of the time, when you're doing swims under an hour, unless you are absolutely drilling it in a pool, you don't need to do anything. Assuming the conditions aren't extreme. If you're lucky enough to be somewhere where the open water swimming is beautiful and warm and the sun is pounding on your back, things might change a little bit, but that's probably unlikely for most of us in the room, unfortunately. So most of the time in training, if it is short, you don't need to do a great deal. As soon as that duration kind of extends beyond 75 minutes, that's where I think an element of fueling is required. Again, because of the unlikely situation of being in very hot water, for most people, fueling is probably more of a priority than hydration when it comes to open water swimming. Again, that only changes if the water's very hot, you do it in a wetsuit and it's hot, or you're swimming very hard. But I'd say for most people, under 60 minutes, don't worry too much. Unless you're in a really hot pool, then maybe some electrolytes on the pool deck would be useful. If you're swimming for 90 minutes open water, something either just before or sticking something like a sports gel in the sleeve of your wetsuit before you go to take after an hour is a good idea. If you're doing 2+ hours, you probably do want to figure out either a loop where you're able to come back and have a couple of swigs of fluid plus maybe eat something. Or if you're building to do an event and you're trying to replicate that event, then I think that's when fueling and hydrating equal to what you want to do in the race is important, because you need to simulate it and test it and make sure that you can stomach it, find out what you do like, don't like, what works for you, what doesn't. So it's kind of a spectrum.
All right, no, that was great, thanks. I'll jump to some of the questions that people sent in advance. And so the first one is, and if you, I think maybe if you've grown up in the 1980s and 1990s, the whole idea that you need to sort of carb load in the days before your event, your pasta meals for the day before the event, have a big pasta meal. Is that something that people still do? Is that something you still recommend?
Yeah.
I know this is nutrition rather than fueling, but I don't know where you stand on that.
No, it's absolutely fine. Yeah, it has stood the test of time, actually. The science is good. There is a limit to it. And actually, how you go about doing it is a little bit different than before. Historically, like you said, in the 80s and 90s, it would be the night before an event. Instead of just eating, you would have 4 bowls of plain pasta and you would eat to the point where you feel like your stomach's going to burst, and then that sets you up for the next day. And I think where things have changed is that a carb loading protocol actually is a little bit longer, so it can span a couple of days. And the difference is actually what you want to do, as much as increase the amount of carbohydrate that you eat, is actually reduce the amount of other things that you eat. So you're not necessarily eating in excess in terms of total amounts. You're just replacing some of the fat, maybe some of the protein, with some additional simple carbohydrates. So it's not just about stuffing your stomach 12 hours before jumping in the pool, because unless you do that every week, your stomach's not going to respond particularly well to that. So actually in the days before, so as an example, I ran London Marathon last week and I did a carb load protocol. So I removed some of the fats and vegetables from a couple of days out. Instead of having a small portion of rice with some meat and a load of leafy greens, I just had a larger portion of rice, a small bit of meat and no vegetables. And over time, it's like, you just remove some of the additional stuff, add in a little bit more. People are becoming more comfortable and aware of using stuff like energy drinks as a way to do this as well. So instead of stuffing yourself with a large kind of bolus of carbohydrate in pasta form or rice form, actually you could eat some additional sweets or drink a sugar drink the day before and your body will still store it. Again, there is a limit to it, and it does need a bit of testing, because what it can do is leave you feeling a little bit lethargic. So should you carb load? I'd say you can carb load. It's worth testing in advance. I would say it's probably only necessary if you're doing something that's over kind of 2 or 3 hours. It doesn't negate the necessity of fueling in the activity, because still you can, at max, once the liver and glycogen are fully topped up, you can store a little bit more during the carb load, but not loads more. You're not going to go from storing 90 minutes to storing 4.5 hours. You're going to go from storing 90 minutes to, I don't know, 85 minutes. So you still need to fuel.
Okay. And the next question, and this is quite an interesting one, because obviously you've got a product that combines carbs and electrolytes. And the question is on, is it better to keep your carbohydrates and your electrolytes separate, or to have them combined?
Yeah, this is a great question, and a really interesting one. I think, unfortunately, like all good questions, the answer is it depends. I'd say the factors to consider, you can do it in any way. There are lots of different ways to do it. You absolutely can use a carbohydrate and electrolyte solution. You can separate them out and do them. Both of them work equally as well. I'd say if you're doing a shorter swim and you want the stops to be quicker, then a mixed solution in terms of fluid is probably best. If you're going longer or the environment is more extreme, separating them out is better. The ability, as I said at the start, a good fueling plan is very, very basic and the same. You're ticking over X grams of carbohydrate every hour for the entire duration. That doesn't mesh particularly well with a hydration plan that needs to be adaptive to your fluid needs. So you might start and it's cold early in the morning, and as you swim and it gets warmer and you try harder, you get warmer, which means you sweat more. So your sweat loss in hour 1 might be 0.5 liter an hour, but your sweat loss in hour 4 or 5 might be 1 liter an hour. And because your losses have doubled, your fluid requirements have doubled with it. Now, if your carbohydrate is tied to the fluid and you simply double your fluid, you've also doubled your carbohydrate intake, which may not be appropriate, and vice versa. If it's really cold and you don't want to drink because you don't want the fluid, don't feel like you need the fluid, then you're going to limit your carbohydrate intake. So being able to be adaptive is really important when you are going longer and the conditions are more extreme. So it kind of depends. For me, shorter, more intense single bottle is just more practical and quick. The longer I go and the more extreme the environment, the more I'd like to separate them out. I think obviously over a really long kind of swim, you would actually do a bit of both, because variety is the spice of life and you just get sick of everything.
The next one, I don't know whether Chris addressed this in the question. I saw there was some coming through on the chat on this. The question was, should I be worried about insulin spikes when consuming sugar-based products like gels and sports drinks?
Yeah, I didn't actually address that in the chat, but someone did mention sugary products, and yeah, the key thing is distinguishing between when you're having these sugary products, because causing insulin spikes typically occurs outside of exercise, because as a regulation of blood sugar, your body actually doesn't use insulin as its primary mechanism during exercise. It's what it uses at rest and not during exercise. And so if you are overeating sugary foods, that's when medical conditions like diabetes can come about, and other pathologies. But during exercise, like JP said right at the very beginning of the presentation, carbohydrates, or sugar in its simplest form of carbohydrate, is what the body relies on to burn as energy. And it's what it circulates in the blood, and it's what the muscles use to perform muscle contractions. And so it becomes pretty much a necessity to introduce some sugars as a mechanism of getting that energy into the blood really quickly and efficiently. Yes, if you're taking 3 gels, if we were just sat here right now, it would cause an enormous, probably a hyperglycemic rebound where our bodies panic to get rid of too much sugar because we don't need it. But if you're balancing the requirements of exercise, which utilize that sugar, then you shouldn't see those huge spikes and troughs, which is common with doing outside of exercise. You'd simply be matching demand. And for the most part, most people are actually fighting a losing battle with that, where they actually end up burning more than they can consume physically, especially during sports like swimming, where it's difficult to get that sugar or those carbohydrates in the first place. And we as human beings are super inefficient when it comes to burning energy. And so we lose a lot of our energy that we burn as heat. And so, yeah, oftentimes we don't eat enough during exercise. That's not me saying you need to eat as much as physically possible, but it's a general case example that we don't often do enough.
Thanks for that. So I think you may have touched on, well, you definitely touched on this, JP, in your presentation when you talked about on longer events having more variety in your fueling. But someone's asked a specific question of on a marathon swim. So let's say it's a swim that's taking 3 hours or more, maybe 6 hours, maybe 9 hours even. Should you deliberately include protein in your fueling strategy on these really long swims?
Yeah, this is a bit of a hot topic in the sports science world at the moment, because historically the answer would be no. It's not really necessary. It's not a particularly efficient fuel, as Chris was just saying about the simple sugars. Protein is really inefficient in terms of fuel. In fact, if you're in extreme cases, if you underfuel in terms of sugar and carbohydrates, your body can break down muscles to release protein to be used as fuel, which is very catabolic and is bad, clearly. But there is some research that suggests over extremely long events. Now we're talking about events that typically result in more obvious muscle damage, like running. That's where most of this is seen at the moment, where introducing small doses of protein may help offset some of the muscle damage. Now, to caveat all of that, like, would I personally introduce some, or would I suggest an athlete introduce some for a swim if it was under 12 hours? Probably not. I don't think it's necessary. We're talking about very long, kind of up to 24-hour swims. And even then it's a bit of a who knows. And the biggest caveat is, as I said, about the longer you go, the more real food you introduce. You'd be hard pushed to introduce real foods that don't include some proteins. So, for example, if you were swimming for 12 hours and you chose to introduce a jam sandwich, which is totally fine and a good option, lots of simple carbohydrates, bread still has some protein in it, and the dose that is recommending, the science is recommending anyway, isn't astronomically more than something like that. So it kind of happens anyway. I wouldn't be focusing on it that much. I certainly would be focusing on foods that I can stomach and I enjoy and allow me to get the primary carbohydrate intake. And if there is some protein alongside it, then it's certainly not going to do any harm, as long as it's not taken in such quantities that it slows down the absorption of the carbohydrate. Because that's the key thing with other macronutrients, is that fat and protein both slow down the absorption of the carbohydrate in the gut, and you really don't want that to happen.
Okay, it's obviously an endlessly fascinating topic, isn't it? And so here's a more of a practical. Well, I don't know if it's practical or, I guess it's this question between fueling versus nutrition. But someone has said that they want to lose weight, and yet the fueling recommendations seems like quite a lot of carbohydrate, quite a lot of calories to take into your body while you're exercising. But if they're trying to lose weight, should they be following the same fueling regime as someone who isn't trying to lose weight, or would you do something differently?
Yeah, it's a great question, and clearly it's loaded as a topic in and of itself. So where to tread carefully here. I think for me, the fueling recommendations, regardless of attempting body weight changes, are very similar. it is fundamentally the day-to-day nutrition that will be kind of vastly different. You don't want to be trying to lose weight within an activity, regardless of the activity. You know, if you're going out and swimming to the point of bonking, depleting your glycogen stores is most likely going to result in an astronomical binge, because I have done it, not on purpose, but you go out and you do an activity, you underfuel by accident or on purpose, and then you get back and either immediately or at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, suddenly the biscuit cupboard looks more fantastic than usual. And then you end up eating in excess of what you would have done anyway. Whereas appropriate fueling for the activity is a far better way to manage hunger and satiety and then control day-to-day diet. So I wouldn't really change the fueling recommendations. There is, again, this is a really open-ended topic, because there is a body of research that's kind of focuses on fueling the work required. So you can manipulate fueling, and this is a whole nother level where you fuel much lighter for kind of lower intensity activities, or maybe you don't fuel for a period of time and then you start fueling. And then when you do swim harder, you fuel more aggressively and you manipulate it to try and create what's called metabolic flexibility. But for most people, that is, you're more likely to trip yourself up trying to do something like that, as opposed to simply following good basic fueling practices and good basic day-to-day nutrition practices, and let the activity itself create a kind of negative energy gradient, really.
Okay. Yeah, as I said, fascinating. Really appreciating your insights here. Here's a question that I've been asked quite often, actually, and I don't know the answer. And I've heard different people say different things on this. If you're swimming in salt water, if you're swimming in the English Channel or doing a channel relay or any long distance swim in the sea, where there's a possibility that you will accidentally ingest seawater, which is salty, does that change what you need to do in terms of hydration and salt replenishment?
Quite simply, no. You should probably review your swimming technique at some point if you find yourself swallowing much seawater. No, essentially the hydration requirements don't necessarily change, or there's no meaningful change. If you were to be under the microscope looking at how your body reacts in salt versus fresh water, you might see some tiny changes. But in terms of fueling and or hydration, particularly relative to electrolyte strategy, the aim is to replenish electrolytes and fluids that you're predominantly losing through sweat loss, and your sweat response doesn't change other than the temperate conditions around. If the temperature of the water changes and it happens to be salty, you might find yourself, and I certainly find myself, feeling like I'm thirstier when I'm swimming in really salty waters, and whether that's because the water is going in your mouth and I'm not swallowing it and it's just drying out my mouth, that might be a perceptual thing rather than necessarily a physiological change in my requirements. And so potentially you might find yourself leaning towards some more fresh water, some plain water, just to simply cleanse your palate and clean out your mouth more than anything, rather than any specific changes. One question I just quickly wanted to answer, actually, which Colin asked in the chat, and I know it's a popular question because we at Precision offer free video calls for anyone that wants to book in and chat one-to-one with our consultations, and I'll pop the link in the chat for that shortly. But we had a question about a 12-hour swim, and I've seen various varieties of this type of swim, which is a 1 mile swim on the hour every hour, whereby the quicker you swim, the longer you get to recover. And so it's balancing pacing and timing, etc. Typically, for fueling and hydrating an event like that, you're quite fortunate in the sense that you can not swim and eat. So therefore, you wouldn't really need to do anything during the swim. you'd probably be needing to prepare beforehand, maybe taking a little bit of energy, like JP said, a simple carbohydrate like a gel or a chew, a few minutes before you get in. But then afterwards, you want to have prepared maybe some real foods that you can chow down and that you enjoy, some fluids that are going to replace the water and electrolytes that you're sweating. But over such a long period of time, you're also at a luxury where you might actually benefit from some warm foods, whereby you can heat up some broth or some soup, or even some other warmed goods to mainly increase your morale during events like this, which, if you're in the middle of the ocean doing an ultra swim, you maybe don't have the luxury of that you're afforded to on a boat. And so the principles are still very similar, but bearing in mind the duration of the exercise is not 12 hours of continuous swimming. You are fueling for basically a mile at a time, but you sort of have to be thinking, 1 or 2 hours ahead rather than in the moment, if that makes sense.
I'm conscious that we're running out of time, and we haven't. There were so many questions that came in. We haven't unfortunately got through all of them, but I'm going to pick one of the other questions just for selfish reasons. Someone was asking about whether it's okay to drink coffee before you go for a swim, either racing or training, I guess. And I'm quite interested in the answer on that one, so I'm sticking that one in as the last question, if that's okay.
Yeah, no problem at all. Luckily for me, it is absolutely fine, because I just would be a fish out of water, quite literally, if I wasn't able to drink a coffee before going for a swim.
Likewise.
I think one of the kind of myths around coffee and caffeine is that coffee can be dehydrating, because we all know you drink coffee and then you need to go to the toilet. But what the best way to think about it really is, that is still a fluid that you're ingesting. It's not going to increase your output. It is just going to induce the output sooner than otherwise. So it is still a net zero, whether or not it happens in 10 minutes or 1 hour. You're still drinking a fluid. It's not in and of itself dehydrating. That's really the short answer. I think one thing, Simon, if I just go back to the salt water thing, because one question that comes up a lot, because people read online about sodium loss and they start reading about sweat testing and the fact that your body reabsorbs sodium, and that is absolutely true. People often think, well, if I swim in salt water, is my skin going to absorb the salt and then I'm not going to need electrolytes? That is a very oversimplified way of the internet saying one thing and meaning something very different. It's absolutely right that your sweat glands reabsorb sodium, so we all lose a very similar amount of total sodium, but then our bodies reabsorb a certain amount, and that's what dictates the net loss, which is what the physical sweat test does. It's used in medical settings to diagnose cystic fibrosis, and the reason why it does that is because individuals with CF have very broken sweat glands, which is why they experience whole body cramping so quickly. So, but it happens at a much more cellular level than just on the skin, which is why if you go out for a run or a bike ride, you can end up with kind of salt marks on your skin or your face. Your body doesn't reabsorb that salt just because it's on your skin. It happens at a much deeper level. So the internet might make you think that you can swim in salt water and that is the same as drinking electrolytes, but that would make life so much easier. But unfortunately, it doesn't happen quite like that.
Okay.
Sorry, that was
we're kind of out of time. We did your colleague, your other colleague Chris, he did share a discount code for the people on the webinar tonight. If anybody is interested in precision hydration products, obviously, I mean, maybe you can take 30 seconds just to tell people a little bit about the products you've got. I'm going to put the link in the chat now to the website.
I think, Simon, at the risk of ruining this nice conversation and talking specifically about products, I would suggest everybody just goes and have a look if they're open to doing so, and if they have any questions. As Chris in this room just said, we offer free one-to-one video consultations with individuals. So if they would like off their own back to have a look on the website and would have any questions about the products or a specific event they're doing or a plan they would like to talk about or an experience they've had, they're absolutely more than welcome to book one of these free, no strings attached 20-minute calls. We have a team of people around the world doing them all day, every day. You know, it's a very small team. It's probably going to be me or Chris, if I'm being really honest. But still, if you do have a specific question, including about the products, I'd suggest we try and put as much information as we can onto the website to try and be as helpful as we can. So I try, at the risk of turning this into a product plug, I'll let everybody else go have a look if they wish to.
Okay. Well, I will share the code just to the people on this call. I mean, it's just outdoor swimmer in block capitals, and that will give you 15% off on the website. I don't know how long that code is open for, but that's what Chris shared and said I could share on the call tonight. I've seen someone's asked about recording. We will return it and we'll put the recording up on YouTube when we've it takes time for Zoom to process it, but once it's processed, we'll put it up on YouTube and share the link with everyone that's on the call tonight.
I can also share the slides with you, Simon. I just saw someone mention that in the chat as well.
That would be great. Thank you very much.
You can have that.
Great.
Brilliant. If we didn't answer anybody's questions, hopefully no one's fallen asleep.
No, they're all they're mostly still here. Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for joining us. If you've got ideas for future sessions that we can do, you can send them directly to me or post them in the chat. I'll always have a read through the chat when we're done anyway. And you know, we try and do one of these every month or so. So hopefully we'll see you all soon on the next one. Thanks for joining us.